the temptation for any successor to frankly use Putin as a scapegoat and maybe even a bargaining chip, whether it's allowing him to go to a war crimes tribunal in The Hague, monstrously unlikely but possible, or just simply to blame him for everything that goes wrong, would actually be quite significant. And therefore, I think Putin, and I don't think we need necessarily to feel particularly sympathetic for him for this, but nonetheless, I think he's stuck. He cannot get down from the tiger he's riding. So to be honest, I think, again, barring some kind of illness that actually sort of forces him to stand down, or political coup from within the elite that at the moment is not very likely, but nonetheless is something that could well happen if things get worse. I think the only way Putin leaves the presidency is in a very ornate coffin.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen. And today we're talking about Vladimir Putin and his illegal war in Ukraine. And I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Galeotti, Honorary Professor at University College London and an expert in Russian politics and global crime. Mark, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Good to be here.
Yesterday, Vladimir Putin was inaugurated for his fifth term as Russian president. How would you assess the relative strength or indeed weakness of his position as he enters that fifth term?
He's in an odd position because on the one hand, he has no rivals. He's just awarded himself a totally implausible 87% of the vote for his election. He's just been inaugurated in great pomp and splendor, but it was really quite striking just how bored he looked, frankly, throughout the inauguration. And yes, he's been here before. So from his point of view, on the one hand, there is no one who's challenging him. On the other hand, though, there is this interesting brittleness about his system. Yes, there's no opposition left anyway. It's all been pushed out the country or pushed 6 feet under. And yet, the interesting thing is that the three pillars on which he's always rested on in the past in order to deal with crises, his personal legitimacy, his capacity to throw more or less unlimited amounts of money at problems, and his control of the security apparatus, all of those are beginning to look a bit shakier. He himself is no longer the sort of great hope of Russia that he was 24 years ago, which is quite extraordinary. Certainly that the money is getting that much less available. And even his control of the security apparatus may not be quite as complete as we assumed, as we saw with last year's mutiny from the Wagner mercenary group. So there's also a certain brittleness. He's fine dealing with the day-to-day, and frankly, dealing with the current war is becoming increasingly almost routine. But on the other hand, as there will be, there are going to be crises, whether that means Putin going sick, whether that means some kind of Ukrainian breakthrough in the war, whether that means some kind of economic crisis, then I think we'll actually get a chance to really see how capable Putin is now at dealing with these unexpected incidents.
And we see time and again with these autocratic leaders that really the safest place for them is in power, and the paranoia grows accordingly. If Vladimir Putin is not Russian president, does he still have a future?
I don't think Putin can step down now. Look, I honestly believe that before the invasion in 2022, that he was actually toying with the prospect of standing down. The problem is this, in a system like this, as you said, it's an autocratic one. It's not law-based, certainly not at the top of the system. Everything depends on your position, your future, the fate of your family, your own physical survival, quite possibly. And for him to stand down means he has to hand all that power to a successor and rely on his successor's loyalty and gratitude. And the trouble is that even if today a successor is willing to be absolutely committed to you, are they going to be the same in a year's time or whatever? The temptation for any successor to frankly use Putin as a scapegoat and maybe even a bargaining chip, whether it's allowing him to go to a war crimes tribunal in The Hague, monstrously unlikely but possible, or just simply to blame him for everything that goes wrong, would actually be quite significant. And therefore, I think Putin, and I don't think we need necessarily to feel particularly sympathetic for him for this, but nonetheless, I think he's stuck. He cannot get down from the tiger he's riding. So to be honest, I think, again, barring some kind of illness that actually sort of forces him to stand down, or political coup from within the elite that at the moment is not very likely, but nonetheless is something that could well happen if things get worse, I think the only way Putin leaves the presidency is in a very ornate coffin.
And what might be the trigger for some kind of internal move against Putin? You say if things get worse, what would need to happen?
I think we've got to realize that this is an elite that is not really full of Putinists. Sure, they will troop along to the inauguration and stand there and applaud as Putin gives his rather perfunctory speech there and so forth. But on the whole, essentially, this is an elite that is full of ruthless, opportunistic kleptocrats. They supported Putin and they support Putin so long as it is in their interest to do so, and so long as the risks in not doing so are sort of clear and visible. So essentially, there's a constant cost benefit analysis. Now, at the moment, there's no question, but that the risks of going against Putin massively outweigh the potential opportunities. But things may well change. And I think, particularly if we start to see, for example, the economy overheating, as may well happen as the war goes on, as we begin to see actually ordinary people feeling more and more the pressure of that, we're likely to see more economic unrest. And that's what's particularly dangerous to the regime. And if that starts to really take off, it's one thing if it's the strike here and a strike there that can be controlled. The big nightmare, I think, is something like the Solidarity Trade Union in Poland back in end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, where almost out of nothing, one strike in a shipyard suddenly became a national movement because there were so many people who were so fed up, and a leadership that basically emerged from nowhere. I think that's the big nightmare, something like that takes all the protest potential that at the moment has nowhere to go in Russia and brings it all together. And that's when we might see the elite beginning to think, well, basically, either we break with Putin now, or we risk finding ourselves hanging from a lamppost in a week or a month or a year's time. But as I said, I think they will need that sense that there is a real threat to themselves. So I think for the moment, everything looks very calm and everyone is saying all the right things. But there is that constant, question assessing today. Is today the day? Of course not. But tomorrow might be, whatever.
And of course, so much of that may depend on what happens in Ukraine. Let's turn to the war directly. Are you expecting, Mark, Russia to launch a fresh ground offensive in the coming weeks?
Well, in a way, Russia has never stopped launching ground offensives. I mean, this is it. What we have seen is a constant incremental push forward. 100 meters here, maybe a kilometer there, but bit by bit they are moving forward, taking advantage of the fact that at the moment they have an advantage in both manpower and ammunition. Though obviously now that we've had the American bill pass through, then at least the ammunition will start to become more evident. I'm not convinced that they have at the moment the resources for some kind of major escalation in their ground offensive. So yes, we're seeing them trying to take Chasiv Yar at the moment. There's talk maybe of a move against Kharkiv in the north in the future. And these are significant. But I think unless Putin bites the bullet and launches another mobilization wave, which if this is going to be meaningful, he has to do pretty damn soon. Because it takes time between announcing it, mustering your forces, giving them some basic training, arming them, getting to the battlefield. And if you're really trying to take advantage of the summer, you've really got to do this in June, July. So unless we see that, I think we will see offensives. We will see the Russians probably pushing forward, but nothing that is going to be absolutely war-winning. It's going to be simply part of this slow accretional conflict.
Are you surprised that Putin hasn't launched a fresh wave of mobilization yet? I mean, a lot of people thought maybe he was waiting for the election to pass. Maybe he's waiting for his inauguration. That has now happened. So are you surprised it's taken this long?
Not really, because this is classic Putin. For all his kind of macho persona, Putin actually tries to avoid taking tough decisions. And when he does, usually he takes them quite late, often too late. We saw that actually with the last mobilization wave. Again, he had been being hassled by his generals for months. And when he eventually did it, really, it was just in time for autumn-winter, which is not really campaigning season. So, it could still happen. It may well be, in some ways, you're right, there was the elections, the inauguration. There is one more milestone, which is the announcement of the new government. Because the current cabinet formally resigns and he appoints a new one, which will probably be much the same as the old one. But there is some thought in the light of the recent arrest of Deputy Defence Minister on corruption charges that maybe Defense Minister Shoigu may be being replaced. And so it may well be that they'll think they'll bring in a new defense minister and use the kind of the momentum of that announcement to also announce a mobilization. So it could still happen, but as I said, it will be classic Putin if he only ends up biting the bullet and doing this in August, September, when he's missed his key window of opportunity.
If he does replace Shoigu as defence minister, what would be the significance of that? Because, of course, there was a lot of beef, I suppose you could say, between Prigozhin and Shoigu. Maybe Putin felt he couldn't move Shoigu too soon because it would appear like he was caving into those demands. What would be the significance if he did move him?
Well, I think to a large degree, it depends very much on who replaces him. I mean, the point is, look, Shoigu has proven to be, I mean, he was a very able civilian, civil peacetime defense minister. He's proven to be catastrophically bad as a wartime one. Now, you've got to realize that what happens is in war, and although this is technically a special military operation, in practice it's a war. In many ways, what happens is the roles of the defense minister and the chief of the general staff reverse. In peacetime, defense minister is boss. In war, in effect, it's the chief of the general staff who kind of calls the shots, reports directly to Putin, and the defense minister's job is just to more or less ensure that the soldiers have everything that they need. Shoigu's done a sort of a middling job of that. But the point is, the key job he hasn't done is been able to bring some real realism into Putin's own discussions. So, although he would clearly, if he went, it would be very popular with the soldiers, for whom he's become deeply unpopular. And it would probably mean a new chief of the general staff, because generally a new defense minister will also bring in a new chief of the general staff. And so the interesting thing is it all depends on who these people are. Now, one of the potential candidates that's sometimes being discussed is the head of the National Guard, Viktor Zolotov, very much a kind of close, loyal Putin crony, who's actually would probably be an even worse defense minister than Shoigu. I mean, certainly if I was sitting in Kiev, I would be rooting for Zolotov. On the other hand, another one of the possibilities is a man by the name of Alexei Dumin, who's the governor of Tula region, a former Putin bodyguard, but also a former deputy defense minister, who actually has a pretty good reputation as being an able organizer. So if it was him and a more effective soldier as chief of the general staff, suddenly the Russian military might be looking in a rather stronger position. This is why exactly it's not so much about Shoigu going. I mean, Putin has held on to him because Shoigu is a friend, a personal friend, and also, again, because Shoigu is, let's say, the continuity candidate. Putin doesn't want to see disruptive upsets at the top of his security apparatus. But if he goes, so much will depend on who replaces him.
Just going back to this issue of Putin's personal position, it was interesting you wrote recently for the Times, Mark, about reports that the Chechen warlord Ramzan Kadyrov is terminally ill. Just remind us, first of all, why Kadyrov is so important and why that would have significant implications for Putin.
In many ways, one of the events that really made Putin and his reputation in Russia was the Second Chechen War, which started when he was actually prime minister before he was president, but then was in a way the first real challenge of his presidency. And look, the Russians won, but the way they won, apart from being monstrously brutal, we saw the capital of Grozny pretty much leveled, was essentially by Chechenizing the conflict, finding their own Chechens to fight the rebel Chechens. And as a result, out from that came a sort of dynastic rule. First of all, it was actually Kadyrov's father, Akhmat Kadyrov, who became the first leader of sort of a loyalist Chechnya. And then in due course, Ramzan Kadyrov, the current one, replaced him. And what's really happened is that in the name of subduing Chechnya, basically Chechnya was bought off on a massive scale. I mean, Kadyrov basically runs Chechnya as his own private personal fiefdom, with extraordinary brutality and extraordinary levels of corruption. Over 80% of the Chechen budget comes from Moscow. It's provided by the federal government. And every time someone says, oh, isn't it time perhaps to cut down on this money? So basically Kadyrov throws his toys out of the pram and Moscow backs down because, frankly, I think Putin and his cohorts have convinced themselves that Kadyrov is the man who's keeping the lid on Chechnya, who's actually, through a mix of brutality and local politics, is able to actually keep the Chechens under control. And what they're terrified of, especially at the moment, is of Chechnya once again boiling over. Because, Chechnya, it's a small region, but it has periodically rebelled against control by the Russians. every time it gets a chance, essentially. And the Chechens, frankly, are hard as nails. So, I mean, for all these reasons, there is that sense of, look, let's just not rock the boat. We know that basically what's happening in Chechnya is ghastly. You've more or less got Sharia law in contravention of the Russian constitution. And Moscow's having to pay for it, as well as a lot of vanity projects. But look, it's just a lot easier to keep the status quo going. But now, if it's true that Kadyrov is mortally ill, and certainly looking at, I mean, he was at the inauguration, and looking at this footage that he needed two guys to help him take his jacket off, he was definitely not looking in good shape. If it's true, then in some ways Putin's hand is going to be pushed at the very moment when he least needs this to happen. Because if there is any sort of kickoff in Chechnya, the question is who would deal with it when his army is, I think it's 97% of all operational ground forces are currently deployed to Ukraine. The last thing he wants is a third Chechen war.
Is there any obvious successor to Kadyrov in Chechnya?
Well, Kadyrov clearly wanted to keep this in the family. And he was grooming his sons to take over, but his oldest son is only 18, has no real credible standing. And in any case, the law says you have to be 30 to be Chechen leader. Now, again, maybe they could tweak that a bit, but probably not 12 years. And although in the past, sort of when Ramzan Kadyrov wasn't quite old enough to take over when his father died, they put in a sort of temporary regent in effect. But a 12-year temporary regency isn't possible. So there are various candidates. The man who Moscow seems to favor is Apti Alaudinov, who is currently the head of commanding Chechen forces inside Ukraine, and to be honest, is a bit more urbane, even to the point of actually he speaks good Russian in a way that Ramzan Kadyrov almost spoke comically bad, accented Russian. Sounded a little bit like something out of Allo Allo. So they would clearly like Alaudinov to take over. But the problem is there's a whole variety of other Chechen bigwigs who also may well feel that they have equally, if not better, status and standing. And, the big concern is if they try and impose Alaudinov, are others going to start kicking off and saying, no, we're not accepting that? And, in Chechnya, there is a whole variety of security forces that are notionally Russian controlled. In practice, they are Kadyrov controlled. And if you take Kadyrov away, these people swear a personal oath to Kadyrov. So if you take him out of the picture, then the risk is that a whole bunch of different warlords will have their own ready-made armies.
Whilst we're talking about the mortality of leaders, we should come on to the news about Zelensky this week. Ukraine says it's arrested 2 security officials on suspicion of plotting with Russia to take President Zelensky hostage and assassinate him. What more do we know about the details of this plot, Mark?
I mean, it's still quite confused. So the interesting thing is that the 2 individuals concerned are meant to actually be colonels within the security apparatus, which, is saying something. A colonel is essentially a fairly senior figure. And I mean, what it speaks to, and again, look, we have no idea of just how accurate it is, and more details will emerge. But it's entirely plausible, firstly, clearly the Russians who dramatically underestimated Zelensky at the beginning of the war. As, in fairness, so did everyone else. No one thought that he would blossom into this extraordinarily effective wartime leader. I think they're aware of the degree to which he is an absolutely crucial factor, not just in holding Ukraine together and mobilizing it, but also in terms of his capacity to cajole, browbeat, and charm the West into continued support for Ukraine. So, although I suppose there's always the risk of turning him into a martyr, I can well understand that Moscow may well prefer him to be out of the picture permanently. But also, it speaks to the fact that actually Russia still has continued penetration of the Ukrainian apparatus, and particularly the security apparatus. I mean, I think this is something that we've seen even 2 years on, is the degree to which the Ukrainians are still finding Russian agents. Now, look, in some cases, I have a suspicion there is a little hint of the witch hunt at work. That, it's too easy to find someone and decide that somehow they're Russian sympathizers because back in 2021 they said, oh, well, maybe Moscow has a case on this point or something. But in many other cases, they are clearly not. They are finding genuine Russian agents. And in that respect, I mean, actually, for me, the surprise is precisely that if they had officers of this standing, that they hadn't basically deployed them already. I mean, again, it's quite interesting, and we don't know whether it's because, again, of political hesitation in Moscow. That sort of sense of, oh, well, will it actually worsen the situation, turn Zelensky into a martyr, push, for example, the American sort of House of Representatives into supporting aid, or whether it was just simply that they just weren't physically in a position to be able to actually spring their plot. But again, it's a case of the Russians having a powerful asset and wasting it.
It's a really good point you raised there, Mark, because surely if Russia did assassinate President Zelensky, that would provoke a stronger reaction from the West and maybe escalate this war.
Exactly. I think this is a problem that the Ukrainians have time and time again shown themselves to be very hard to predict for the Russians. And in part that, actually, look, there's a lot of really smart Russia analysts and so forth Ukraine analysts within the Russian government structure, whether we're talking about the intelligence services or the foreign ministry or whatever. The problem is that the people at the very top, Putin and those people closest to him, have this extraordinary notion of Ukraine. It's clear, we've seen this from Putin's speeches and his deeply weird historical essays, that as far as he's concerned, Ukraine is not a real country. The Ukrainians are not a real people. Part of Ukraine, frankly, is just a semi-detached part of Poland, and the rest really is part of kind of Russia's cultural space. And, once he's got that fixed in his mind, Putin clearly is not willing to listen to alternative perspectives. And this has been one of the recurring problems for the Russians, time and time again, that, it's not that they don't know what's going on. It's that Putin either cannot or will not accept the reality. So in this context, I think this is probably why it's such a challenge to try and assess accurately. I mean, it's difficult for any of us to have a real sense of whether taking Zelensky out of the picture would improve or worsen the Ukrainians' position. I think that what we're now seeing is precisely that having managed to get Ukraine so wrong so often, to a degree, the Russians are partially paralyzed by their understanding of the fact that they don't understand Ukraine. And therefore, again, I imagine that this is quite possibly one of those kind of plots which someone operationally sets up, more or less saying, look, guys, boss, if you want Zelensky dead, we think we found a way of doing it. And yet then the political leadership ums and ahs, not out of any kind of humanitarian impulse. I mean, they clearly did try to kill Zelensky at the very beginning of the war, after all. So certainly it's not humanitarian. It's that they don't really know. They are to a degree paralyzed by their continued inability to really understand what makes Ukrainians tick, let alone then how the West might respond.
It's fascinating how it's reported that this was planned as an inauguration gift for Vladimir Putin. How much does Zelensky personally get under the skin of Vladimir Putin?
He clearly does. And I think, again, it speaks to a wider issue. In some ways, the problem, as far as Putin is concerned, is that Zelensky is, a fairly, in some ways, or has been a fairly Russified Ukrainian. He grew up speaking Russian. His early career actually was in Russia. That's when he really began to make his name as a comedian and then an actor. It was on the Russian scene before he went home. Now, we know that Putin has this kind of weird way of looking at the sort of distinction between enemies and traitors. Enemies you fight with, but the point is you may sometimes be able to reach some kind of a deal with them. Traitors, though, you can do nothing with traitors except wipe them out. Whether that means, as we've seen, a defector getting shot in Spain, or I think this is why sort of Putin has trouble with Zelensky. As far as he's concerned, Zelensky is in some ways a traitor, because he should be on the pro-Russian side of Ukrainians. He should be, as Putin sees it, willing to understand Moscow's point of view and willing to accept that Moscow has cultural, political, historical hegemony over Ukraine. And the fact that Zelensky turns round and sort of holds together this extraordinary coalition government, or coalition of the people, really, rather, in order to precisely resist Russia so effectively, I suspect, and again, look, trying to psychoanalyze Putin is in many ways a foolish and dangerous venture, but we all do it anyway. I suspect that's what really gets under Putin's skin. because as far as he's concerned, Zelensky is not an enemy, but a traitor.
And as you say, we know that Russia have been coming up with plots to assassinate Zelensky for years now. Do you think the reverse is true? Are the GRU, is Ukrainian military intelligence actively planning to assassinate Putin?
I mean, to be honest, I'm sure they would have no problems. I mean, particularly, of all the various agencies of the Ukrainian government, the military intelligence seems to be the most gung-ho, sometimes I would suggest counterproductively in terms of some of the operations they carry out. But on the other hand, we have to acknowledge that there is a massive security structure built around Putin. I mean, I remember once, this is even before the war, living on one of the big thoroughfares that head into the center of Moscow. And, the ones that Putin would take those rare times he was going to the Kremlin from his palace outside. And, for hours before, you've got snipers on the rooftops and people checking all the manhole covers and people's being stopped from actually leaving their apartment buildings. And so forth. I mean, it really was amazing sort of operation before this huge sort of 60-odd car and motorbike motorcade zoomed along the road. And I'm sure that now under wartime, it got even more restrictive. So, I think in that context, it would be very difficult for the Ukrainians to get at him, especially because the Russians had been basically penetrating the Ukrainian political and security structures for years, in part particularly benefiting from certain leaders, such as the previous leader Yanukovych, who were actually fairly pro-Moscow, and in some ways opened up windows of opportunity for the Russians to recruit agents. There's never been that kind of similar opportunity or really need until recently for the Ukrainians to do the same. So again, if they felt they had an opportunity, would the Ukrainian military intelligence take out Putin? Quite possibly. Though, on the other hand, I also suspect that, as we've seen in the past, it will be Zelensky who then reins them in, for fear that something like that would lead to some catastrophic escalation and, I don't know, nuclear explosions above Kiev or something similar. So, again, I'm sure the spooks would love it, but they tend to get kind of carried away with their own opportunities. I suspect that the Ukrainian political leadership would ultimately say, better not. And again, it's sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but this is one of these classic issues in covert operations. For example, if the Allies could have killed Hitler during World War II, should they have done so? And the general consensus is usually no. Before the war, absolutely. But once the war had started, and in a way, once Germany was locked into that, well, Hitler was a pretty bad war leader. And the danger is you take Hitler out, you might have someone more competent in place. Actually, much the same is true of Putin. In many ways, Putin has been Ukraine's secret weapon throughout this war. And why would you want to throw that away?
Just to round things off, Mark, if we zoom out a bit, where do you think we are in the wider context of this war? How significant a moment are we in?
It's always tempting to come up with a why now really matters. In some ways, I don't think that it is crucial. I think that we knew going into this year that it would be the year in which Russia had the advantage. Now, the delay in getting American aid to Ukraine has actually magnified that advantage, and that's what we're seeing play out on the battlefield. But even with all the advantages, it's clear that the Russians are not in a position to deliver some kind of knockout blow. Now, who knows what can happen in war? Tomorrow there might be some kind of breach of the Ukrainian front line, allowing the Russians to move further, but there's very little sign that that's likely to happen. And therefore, we're still really talking about this as a year in which the Ukrainians primarily have to do two things. One is endure, which is no small matter. Particularly when you look at their casualties proportionate to their population, it's actually greater than the Russians are suffering. And secondly, they have to kind of work out ways properly to kind of metabolize the new weapons, the new equipment that they're getting from the West. Because the plan seems to be at present that 2025 is when the Ukrainians plan to launch another major counteroffensive. So in some ways, this is a year of a kind of a holding action as far as the Ukrainians are concerned. And it's going to be next year then that really is a crucial one. Because frankly, if that counteroffensive doesn't work, or is a sort of a only partial success, I'm not sure if Ukraine will have a third counteroffensive in it. And I'm not sure that the West, for all its current protestations about being in it for the long haul and so forth, whether it really would be willing to continue to support it at this level. So I think at the moment it's simply a question of, from the Ukrainians' point of view, minimizing their losses and building up the forces necessary for proper operations next year, by which time, Western attempts to build up ammunition supplies will have, actually begin to bear fruition. We'll have the F-16 jets in Ukrainian hands, as well as a whole slew of not just long-range missiles, but other kind of kit. And perhaps most importantly of all, hopefully by that point, the Ukrainians will have had a chance to really work out how they can develop new tactics to take fullest advantage of that, which is something that we didn't really see happening fully effectively in last year's counteroffensive.
Mark, we always appreciate your insight and expertise. Thank you for joining us today on Frontline.
Glad to join you.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.